here we are. We are in the long-awaited time when we get to talk about the Civil War, and this time we're going to divide the Civil War up into two parts because there's just way too much stuff to cover here. But we were planning for that. So today we're going to talk about the Civil War Part 1, what I like to refer to as the Age of Lee. Now, there's many different ways of dividing up the Civil War and analyzing and talking about it in different perspectives. I like to break it up into what I call the Age of Lee and the Age of Grant. It's got its weaknesses and its strengths, but I think it's the way I want to do it, so we'll do it that way. Now we're going to deal with analyzing the causes of the Civil War and the strengths and weaknesses of each side and how that's going to play out during this time, during the early years of the Civil War. The years I'm looking at covering are between 1861 and 1862, so we're going to get into that. This, of course, corresponds with Key Concepts 5.3.1 in your AP guide. So, before we get into this, we're going to talk a little bit about the causes. And the causes are really rather simple with regard to the Civil War, and that you can't say that very often about many things with regard to history. But the causes for Civil War are relatively simple. The reality is that the Southern states were seeing the writing that was on the wall, and they were seeing the end of slavery coming in the short term, and they wanted to avoid that. So finally the disputes that the sectional disputes about slavery are going to come to a head in 1860, and that's going to be the end of the Union, at least for the short term. So, but before we do this, we want to talk a little bit about the Republican Party that I mentioned last lecture, and to talk a little bit about a rising star in the Republican Party, a former Whig by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Now, the Republican Party is going to form largely from the backbone of the disaffected Whigs who abandoned their party after the Kansas-Nebraska Act fiasco in 1854. The Whigs are going to abandon, and they're going to try to start a few other little parties that never really caught on, but eventually are going to settle upon a new party called the Republican Party. And they're going to join in. They're going to be joined by some folks from the nativist Know Nothing Party, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And there were even some other radical groups. So, for instance, the emphasis on abolitionism that the Republican Party adopted was also attractive to other groups, such as a growing number of socialists who were coming into the United States. So the early Republican Party was kind of a hodgepodge of different groups, largely from the Northern Whig Party, but also some other influences. But what was binding these groups together was the stance on abolitionism. So the Republican Party is going to form, largely influenced by the Whig Party, and it's going to really gain attention in a Senate campaign in Illinois between one Stephen Douglas of Kansas-Nebraska Act fame and our very own Abraham Lincoln. This will be this campaign will involve the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Be careful. One common misconception is that the Lincoln-Douglas debates were presidential debates. They were not. They were actually senatorial debates that took place in 1858. And consequently, what ended up happening, now you got to understand that Stephen Douglas was the preeminent debater of his time. He was considered one of the great orators of all time. And here he is going up against this tall, gangly, awkward-looking fellow with a rather shrill, annoying voice, lawyer, a rather successful lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And during these debates, Abraham Lincoln actually comports himself very well. Did Lincoln win the debates? That's up for debate. But one thing is certainly sure is that in these debates, this relatively minor candidate by the name of Abraham Lincoln actually handles himself quite well. He holds his own with the greatest orator of his time. So Abraham Lincoln, of course, gets a lot of attention for this and becomes very, very popular as a result of this debate. And of course, he is a former Whig who is now a Republican, and the Republican Party gains in status as a result of this. And then the proof will be in the pudding in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln is nominated to run for President of the United States with his vice president, presidential nominee Henry Hamlin. And we got to kind of take a look now. How exactly does Abraham Lincoln pull this off? Remember, the Republicans at this point are kind of a third party almost. There's kind of an upstart party. How did they pull off this win? And we can kind of see from this map here just exactly how we pulled this off. Now, one of the things that Abraham Lincoln had going for him was that the rest of the field was relatively divided. Southern Democrats were in favor of a fellow by the name of Breckinridge, and but the Northern Democrats, the Democratic Party itself, had kind of split, and they had actually nominated their own candidate, Stephen Douglas. Welcome back, and to further complicate things, there was another fellow, a fourth person, by the name of Bell, running for what was called the Constitution Party. And these three separate forces, the split in the Democratic Party between Northern and Southern Democrats, that was largely a part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the influence of the Constitution Union Party is going to split the electorate and allow Abraham Lincoln with to gain the larger electoral votes in the northern states and win the election. But look at this. Look at here. When we take a look at the actual popular vote, let me do my magic pen here, it's really difficult to do these corners here. But let's take a look here. I'm going to cut a little bit of it off here, and we'll take a look. Let's take a look at Abraham Lincoln's percentages here. Abraham Lincoln only gets 40% of the popular vote. So, despite the fact he does get a majority of the electoral college, he doesn't get the popular vote. So Abraham Lincoln is going to come into this election. He's a president during one of the most divisive times in our country, and he does not have a popular mandate. Most people in the country actually voted against Abraham Lincoln. So this is going to become a huge problem because many of these southern states now are going to look at Abraham Lincoln, whom they are convinced is an anti-slavery candidate, that he is going to end slavery. Now, during his campaign, of course, he promised and swore upside down and backwards that he was not going to end slavery. He did not feel that he as president, would have the authority to end slavery. He really kind of double-crossed his heart and promised not to end slavery. He was simply against the extension of slavery in the territories, but had no intention of ending slavery. But the reality is, the election of Abraham Lincoln, the rising power of the Republican Party, many Southerners felt that the writing at this point was on the wall. The balance in the Senate was already upset, and this was just a lot more than the Southern states could take. So they started to secede from the Union. At first, of course, it was the deep southern states. South Carolina, of course, they're going to be leading the charge. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. But later on, Florida, the Carolinas, and or North Carolina, Virginia eventually will secede. Tennessee will secede. Texas, of course, will secede. And it didn't happen all at once. It was a systematic thing. But these southern states are going to leave the Union, and they are leaving the Union to protect the institution of slavery. Yes, we can make the states' rights argument. That is a central part of the Confederate philosophy, as we know from the Constitution that the Confederate states wrote up. They formed a government relatively quickly. They wrote a constitution. It wasn't really difficult for them to write the Constitution. It looked pretty much just exactly like the United States Constitution, except it had provisions in there. First, emphasizing states' rights and the rights of states to nullify and to secede from the Union. Clearly, they believe that's true. But also, in this Constitution, they make it nearly impossible for them to end slavery, which is very, very telling. Now, overall, in this time, there was some real firebrands out there. But instead of the real firebrands, the Confederate States turned to a fellow by the name of Jefferson Davis, a relatively moderate figure, to lead the Confederate States, to be president of the Confederate States. They chose him because of his background, his experience. He was a very popular politician, but he was also not one of the firebrands. He was not one of the more radical members. He was a much more moderate member, and the goal here was to kind of lend legitimacy to the Confederate government at this point. But Jefferson Davis is going to come into this with a profound disadvantage. Namely, how do you hold a country together that is premised on secession? How can you then get the states to do what you need them to do? This was virtually, in fact, it was a very impossible thing for Jefferson to do. The hidden contradiction here is that you're trying to form a country out of a bunch of individual states that will always maintain their willingness to secede from the Union. So Lincoln is going to walk into his presidency with a country that was no longer unified. Understand, of course, that he was elected in November of 1860, but he doesn't actually get to be president and take office until March of 1861. Well, what's happening during this time? I'm sure the president of that time, Mr. President Buchanan, is going to do something to try to stop these southern states from seceding from the Union, so that Lincoln doesn't have as big a mess to walk into. No, he isn't going to do much of anything to try to stop these southern states. He was of course a lame duck president at that time. In other words, he no longer really had a mandate to lead, but he really didn't do anything to stop these states or to intervene. So by the time Lincoln actually becomes president, he is facing the fact that multiple states have seceded from the Union. More states are threatening to secede from the Union, and he's got to hold this down. In fact, his inaugural address, given very symbolically in front of the Capitol building, it was a miserable, rainy day. It was muddy out there, and the Capitol was not yet complete. The dome was still being built, so he's surrounded by all of this scaffolding and flapping tarps and stuff like that. His speech was not one of his better speeches. It was actually a rather desperate attempt to try to convince people to not leave the Union, to come back, and let's play nice in the sandbox. It was rather winded and lengthy speech, not like we were used to from reading Lincoln's later speeches. But he did have some moments of greatness in the speech. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends we must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. Well, yeah, that was some pretty good wishful thinking, Abe, but unfortunately, the better angels of our nature did not persevere in this. In fact, what's ultimately going to end up happening is the very first crisis that President Lincoln is going to have to face is going to be a no-win scenario. It is, and of course, it being a no-win scenario, Lincoln doesn't win it. It was what is going to become known as the Battle of Fort Sumter, or the Fort Sumter crisis, in which, hey, look, South Carolina has seceded from the Union, but there is a very important military base, American military base in Charleston Harbor. The people of South Carolina said, hey, we are no longer part of the United States, so all of these U.S. soldiers are going to have to get out. And, of course, there's no way that Abraham Lincoln can take these soldiers out of this fort. If he does that, he's basically conceding that South Carolina does, in fact, have the right to secede, which he is making the claim they do not. So he can't give in to them in this way. He's got to keep them there, but at the same time, they kind of also have to be fed. He's got to get supplies to this fort, and he's got to find a way to get the supplies in there. And South Carolina is saying, if you supply that fort, we are going to consider it an invasion. The South Carolina calls up its militia. They surround the fort. Abraham Lincoln sends news down and says, hey, look, all right, I'm going to provision the fort, but I'm not going to arm it. So we're just going to send food and the things that they need to survive. Don't open fire on the fort. Well, the South does in fact open fire on the fort. They bombard the fort. Within short order, the Union soldiers in the fort surrender. I don't believe there were any. I think a horse got killed, but it was a relatively minor battle as far as casualties are concerned. But this was a significant battle. As far as the United States was concerned, because here we actually have a military body in the South opening fire and firing cannons at a Union military. So not good. And this is going to absolutely outrage the North. Now the North were in the throes of saying, hey, well, wait a minute, maybe we still have time to negotiate. We still have time to do something. But now that the battle has been closed, there is no negotiation at this point. The Civil War has started. And here's what we look like. Here's the map. The dark blue states are your free states, and also turn out to be your Union states. This red line, of course, designates north of that red line are your Union states, and your tan are your slave states. The red line, of course, designating the Confederate states. Well, wait a minute now. What's going on? Well, what's going on is we've got these tan states that are north of the Union Confederate boundary. What's happening there? Well, not all of the slave states decided to leave the Union. A few of these slave states decided to remain in the Union. And this had a lot to do with some of the politicking going on with the Lincoln administration. But we have Missouri, we have Kentucky, and Delaware. The slavery existed in Delaware and Maryland. Wait a minute, what's this? This is West Virginia. And this is a perfect example. Virginia decides to secede from the Union. The people in the western part of Virginia said, we don't want to secede from the Union, so we're going to secede from you. And West Virginia left Virginia and became part of the Union. And, well, you can't really stop them, can you? Because your entire country is based on the premise of secession. So West Virginia secedes from Virginia and remains part of the Union. Now, this was a blessing. I mean, these are very strategic sites. Missouri controls a big chunk of the Mississippi River and, of course, access from the Missouri River coming into and joining in. Kentucky controls the Ohio River and is also a site of a lot of coal deposits, which is necessary to run our industries. Same holds true with West Virginia. Maryland. Had Maryland decided to join the Confederacy, we would have lost the capital of Washington, D.C. So, and even Delaware controls access to ocean access going into Pennsylvania. These were very strategic states. They decided to remain in the Union, and in doing that may have changed the course of the war. The blue, of course, is territories, and they were not necessarily counted in this. But we can kind of see what's happening here. We've got awful lot of confusion going on, but we also have a very big chunk of real estate that now Abraham Lincoln is going to have to figure out, how am I going to get this really large territory back into the Union? I mean, by conquest. I mean, we're talking a real challenge here. This was a huge, huge area. Now, the North had some things going for it. One thing, the North had twice the population that the South had, as free population as the South had. The North was also in possession of about 9 times of the industrial resources that the South had. The South had some industrial resources, but the North had an awful lot more. They had the ability to manufacture the things that they were going to need for the war, and they also had about 3/4 of the railroads were located in the North, which meant that the North could actually mobilize the resources that they needed to fight this war a lot more efficiently than the South could. And also, the North had control of the seas, and we're going to see why that's important in just a moment. The South is also going to have some advantages. For instance, the South is going to be fighting mostly a defensive war. They don't actually have to win any of the battles. All they have to do is not lose. All they have to do is hold on long enough to just make their northern invaders go away. And in fighting this defensive war, they also have home field advantage. They know the terrain. They're used to the climate. They know this. They know this field, and that is, a huge advantage, at least at first. So long as the war doesn't last all that long, that home field advantage may be very, very important, just like it was in the American Revolution. We also see that the South also had better leadership. Some of your better generals, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Jackson, J.E.B. Stuart. So these were very, very incredibly good leaders and good generals and strategists and tacticians, and they were largely siding with their states and staying in the South. And also, finally, the South also had more of a martial culture. In other words, culturally, the people of the South were more experienced with guns, more experienced with. They had more of a culture that supported military participation, and they were more experienced with horseback, as J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry is going to demonstrate during the Civil War. So both sides have some pretty significant strengths. And what's more is this is going to be played out at the very first Battle of Bull Run. The very first Battle of Bull Run. The North at this point, by the way, they're conscripting soldiers, but they're only conscripting soldiers for about 90 days at this stage of the game. It's kind of understood. The North is kind of making it understood that this is going to be a relatively short war. They come together outside of Bull Run in Virginia, and in fact, you've actually got people coming from all around, pitching their blankets, having a picnic, and watching the battle as if it was just like a Saturday night Saturday entertainment. And then the bombs started falling, and the relatively unprepared and ill-trained Union soldiers are going to march up against this pretty incentivized Southern soldiers, and to try to break their line, and the line isn't going to break. And instead of an organized retreat, the Northern soldiers start to run and run. And unfortunately, the Southern soldiers weren't all that disciplined either. Many of them took off after the Northern soldiers, and this just turned into a just colossal mess. But regardless of the situation, the Battle of Bull Run was won by the Confederacy, and this demonstrated that this war was going to be a lot longer and harder than we were planning on it being. Now, the Northern Plan, the Union Plan, in this was called the Anaconda Plan. Let's write that down. We'll call it the Anaconda Plan. It's a great name. It was actually a name that was used. That was kind of used as kind of an insult. But either way, this Anaconda Plan was drawn up by our buddy Winfield Scott. Remember him from the Mexican-American War? Well, he's still alive. He's old, but he's still alive. He's still around, and he's not going to be doing any of the battling stuff. But he drew up this plan and decided this was a really great way to choke the Confederacy out. And one of the components of this plan is, first, we want to use our naval superiority to blockade the South. Don't let anything in, don't let anything out. Certainly don't let them sell their cotton. Cotton was a valuable commodity, and we don't want them to be able to sell their cotton and make money off of that and be able to exchange that for war supplies from Britain or France. Next, we want to split the Confederacy in half by taking control of the Mississippi River. And then finally we want to invade the South. We want to put pressure on the capital of the Confederacy, which was located in Richmond, Virginia, and we want to invade the heartland of the South. In return, the Confederacy is planning on what they kind of refer to as an aggressive defense. They're going to put as much pressure on the Union forces, attacking, even planning on attacking inside Union territory to kind of keep Union soldiers, Union armies busy, and keep them from invading and cutting into the heartland. And this was called the Anaconda Plan. We'll see how this works out. Lincoln and Davis. Now, Lincoln and Davis, if we do a real quick comparison, Lincoln, without any Southern opposition, without hardly any Democratic opposition in Congress, Lincoln is actually now a bearded Lincoln is going to be able to accomplish quite a bit of the Republican agenda. Remember, the Republican agenda was largely composed of these of Whigs. And these Whigs were advocates of the old American system that was presented by Alexander Hamilton and pushed by Henry Clay. And we see some of this stuff happening here. First, we got to finance the war, and we're going to finance the war by going into debt. We sell bonds. But we also, Lincoln also institutes the Legal Tender Act. He's going to actually create the very first national paper currency. These were known as greenbacks because of the dye on the prints, on the notes. He also institutes a National Bank Act. Look, we can't have banks printing their own banknotes that are going to compete with our greenbacks, because that's going to devalue our greenbacks. So what we want to do is we're going to pass this National Bank Act, making it illegal for banks to pass on their own notes. Also, national banks are going to have to, not national bank, we're not creating a national bank here, but state banks, we're going to have to apply for a national or federal charter. We create the moral tariff, which is going to raise tariffs, in fact, double tariffs from pre-war levels to try to pay for this war. We're also going to institute a Homestead Act. Now, this doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with the war, but we're going to put the Homestead Act into effect, allowing people to move out into the Western territories and secure 160 acres of land, so long as they can live on it and produce on that land in 5 years. Also, along with that, we'll create a Moral Land Grant Act, which is going to create land grant colleges in these new territories. We're going to charter the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads to build the Transcontinental Railroad. We're finally going to try to build this Transcontinental Railroad that had been eluding us for so long. And most importantly, Abraham Lincoln, with his Secretary of State, William Seward, a former Whig leader, are going to have quite a bit of diplomatic success in keeping Britain and France from joining and participating in this war. A lot of that had to do with the nature of the war itself. Britain and France were very interested, or at least the people in power in Britain and France were interested in a Confederate victory. However, it was very difficult for them to sell this to their own people because it seemed that they were going to be fighting a war to defend slavery, and the people of Britain and France were not willing to go to war to defend slavery. So, seeing this little notch, Seward is going to be able to keep Britain and France from dedicating much resources. They're going to dedicate a few resources, don't get me wrong. They're going to slip some stuff in there to help the Confederacy out a little bit. But for the most part, actually keeping Britain and France out of the war was a huge, huge success for the Lincoln administration. A lot of stuff going on. Davis, on the other hand, has that problem that we were talking about earlier. How do you get a bunch of states that are premised on secession from doing what you want them to do? He couldn't tax them because the state governors refused to pay increased taxes. Remember, opposition to the tariffs was a big deal, in these states. So he was stuck with just kind of printing money. And that money really didn't have any value in and of itself. Who invests in currency for a nation that may not exist in the next year? So all they could do was print money, and they were experiencing something like 9,000% inflation, which is just absolutely unbelievable. But either way, as premised in the beginning here, I like to talk about this militarily from the standpoint that these early years was the age of Lee. And in essence, you had two main armies facing each other. The Army of the Potomac was the Union Army in the east, trying to invade Virginia. There were other armies. We're going to talk about the West next lecture. We'll talk about the naval campaigns in the next lecture. But for now, we want to focus on the Army of the Potomac, which was the main Union Army, the army that was going to end the war. And we also had the Army of Northern Virginia, which was commanded by the brilliant Robert E. Lee. And this was the main defensive army. Of course, Lee's plan is largely to fight a very aggressive defense. And what we're going to find is a lot of the generals that he's up against. Lincoln is, first it's going to be a fellow by the name of George McClellan. George McClellan was very, very cautious going into battle, whereas Lee tended to be a lot more bold. McClellan will get the name Tardy George McClellan, and he'll frustrate Lincoln a great deal, because he's just going to be very hesitant in going to battle. Largely because McClellan said his army wasn't ready, and the reality is, at least in the beginning, he was right. His army wasn't ready. Lincoln will ultimately push him into going into combat, into what becomes known as the Peninsula Campaign, and the Peninsula Campaign was a horrible failure. So among the early Confederate successes was Lee outmaneuvering McClellan constantly and incessantly, and finally forcing McClellan to abandon the Peninsula Campaign and return back into Union territory. Lee followed this up with a number of battles known as the 7 Days, in which he's going to rout some more of, McClellan will be fired by Lincoln. He'll be replaced by a General Pope and a General Burnside and General Hooker. And Lee is going to beat up on all of them, basically, at the 7 Days, at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and also later on, after an abortive attempt to invade the North, which we'll talk about in a moment, Lee will have further successes at the Battle of Fredericksburg in defending Richmond and Battle of Chancellorsville. So things were actually looking really, really good for the Confederacy. For the most part, General Lee and his generals were winning most of the major battles. The one exception to this was a very different battle called the Battle of Antietam. This is going to be the single bloodiest 24 hours in American history. But what's really different about this battle is Lee's going to kind of go off strategy here for a moment here. Lee realizes that fighting this defensive war might work, but he really needs to kind of get some help. Some of those border states like Maryland, there were an awful lot of folks in Maryland that supported the Confederacy. And also, he needed to have a Saratoga-like victory to convince Britain and France to get more involved in this war and to actually take the side of the Confederacy. So he decides the only way to do this is going to be to actually invade the North, invade Union territory. So he's going to do this by invading Maryland. His hope, of course, is that as he invades Maryland, people will join his army, and Maryland will secede from the Union, and then the Union loses its capital. It was a pretty strategic move. He invades Maryland, but his forces are pretty bedraggled and beaten up. They've been fighting very hard, and most of the people in Maryland were looking at them going, yeah, that's really not anything we want to participate in. So he didn't get the support that he was hoping to get in Maryland. And finally, he will face a very desperate General McClellan outside of Antietam, and they will basically fight to a standstill. Unfortunately for Lee at this point, Lee is in foreign territory. He can't supply himself. He can't sustain himself. He can't engage in a pitched battle for a very long time under these circumstances. He's also outnumbered. So once this fight comes to a stalemate, Lee has to abort the field. He has to leave, and he will then leave, and he will return to Virginia. So the very first actually offensive on the part of the South is going to end badly for General Lee. Lee's not done, of course. I mean, after the Battle of Antietam, he'll still have Fredericksburg, still have Chancellorsville, as some major victories, but the Battle of Antietam is pretty significant. In fact, it had the opposite effect that he was hoping for. It entrenched the idea that Maryland is going to stay in the Union, and it also discouraged England and France from participating in the war. And it also gave the opportunity to Abraham Lincoln to make kind of a very cautious move, but a very politically strategic move. And that is, it's going to give Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to sign what becomes known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And what the Emancipation Proclamation does is, again, this is not a radical document. It's a very, very moderate document. But in essence, the Emancipation Proclamation is the first step to emancipating slaves. In this case, it frees slaves in Confederate territories. It frees slaves in those areas that are controlled by the Confederate States of America. In rebel territories. The goal, of course, was to get the Confederate States to abandon this battle, but they didn't. But we have to understand what it does not do. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. In fact, no slaves were freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation at this stage of the game. Later on, maybe, but not at this point. The reality is it only frees slaves in those territories that Lincoln had absolutely no power to enforce the liberation of slavery in Confederate territories. It excluded slaves in the border states. He had to. Lincoln could not afford to lose these border states, so he's going to allow them to hold on to their slaves. Also, it doesn't free slaves in those territories that are already held by Union forces. So actually, the slaves in territory where the president actually has jurisdiction didn't benefit from the Emancipation Proclamation. But it does actually give these slaves hope that ultimately slavery will come to an end in the United States, and it actually gives the war a moral sense, a moral authority. So all of a sudden, people who were a little bit on the fence with regard to fighting the Civil War now feel that the Civil War might be a worthwhile moral cause if we are fighting to free slaves in southern lands, in southern territories. It also makes it much more difficult for European powers to get involved in the war because, again, these nations had already abandoned slavery, and the people in those nations were very morally, outraged by slavery. So to go against this Emancipation Proclamation means that this is definitely, you're definitely going to war to support slavery, and we don't want to do that. So from the point of view of the North, it was a moderately hopeful step that is going to provide moral authority to the war. The South is, of course, going to be outraged, and, of course, that means there is going to be no way to actually convince the South to voluntarily come back into the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation means that the Union is in this for the long haul. They have to militarily bring the South back into the Union. And of course, from the point of view of Europe, they lose their moral authority to support the Confederacy and to weaken the United States. So this is it. We're going to leave it off at this. We're going to pick up later on in what I like to refer to as the Age of Grant. So we'll talk about that later on.